and welcome to Sectors Up Close. I'm Elena Casas. Our focus today is investing in infrastructure, and our guest is Mike Hansen, Fisher Investments Senior Vice President of Research. US President Joe Biden's pledge last week to spend $2.3 trillion on infrastructure has investors wondering how to position themselves. The proposal would use a rise in corporation tax to fund a variety of projects, from transportation and water to care for the elderly and affordable housing. It also includes $50 billion for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Biden says he'll unveil the second part of his recovery package in a few weeks, meaning total spending could double to more than $4 trillion. Meanwhile, over the past year, indices and funds that track infrastructure have outperformed. This index is up 106% in the past year and 21% year to date. Companies that make up the largest ETF tracking the index are involved in the production of raw materials, heavy equipment, engineering and construction. So not all would be direct beneficiaries of some of Biden's spending priorities. So, can investors benefit from all this government largesse? And if so, how? Let's ask Fisher Investments' Mike Hansen. Mike, hello, thanks for joining us. You are, I know, quite sceptical that much of what's in this announcement will really turn into projects. Why is that?
Well, Elena, first, I do think that this spending is very real, and it is on the large side, depending on how you look at it. It will help some groups very much. But in a macro sense, it's just relatively small at this point. And you said it very well. There could be more spending on the way. But as presented today, it's an underwhelming infrastructure plan. You're talking about a little over $2 trillion in spending, but over 10 years. That comes to a couple $100 billion in spending over the course of that time on average. And for a US economy that's $21 trillion in size, for a global economy that's $83 trillion in size, it's not very much. It's not enough to move the needle. But on the other side of it, there were huge hopes and fears about taxes as well. And I've found that to be, at least so far, underwhelming too. The corporate tax rate, which will, if it goes to 28%, which I'm skeptical about, already Senator Manchin has said that he felt 25% would be more appropriate, still keeps US companies very competitive. And yet it's not a huge tax change. So it's underwhelming in both directions. And I think that's the real story, at least so far.
Given that, then, should investors be looking at traditional infrastructure funds or something else?
Well, there's a huge amount of talk about it. And I think one of the big risks today is that over the course of the last 3 months, there's been this great narrative about high spending in governments across the world, including infrastructure, and that would really supercharge the economy for a prolonged period of time. Now, I do think we're going to see great economic growth this year, but I also see it moderating. The narrative that says we'll see high cyclical growth, and as a result, those value-oriented companies, especially those value-added manufacturing companies that will continue to do well, I'm fairly skeptical of that. I think the size of this infrastructure package would need to be much larger to see those companies continue to outperform. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as this was all announced last week, growth stocks, non-cyclically oriented stocks, started to rally and outperform.
How should investors position themselves then to make the most of this package?
Well, anytime you find an area that is so widely discussed, there are going to be opportunities. Of course, everyone's talking today about these big industrial companies and a lot of things like commodities and so forth. And I think a lot of those areas can do just fine. They'll be okay investments. But think second order and think about the second order effects of what's about to happen. Infrastructure today is different than it used to be. There's even money allocated for this infrastructure spending plan for technology. A lot of infrastructure is tech. And whether it's electric vehicles, which I do think will get a boost out of this package, or anything else, you'll need a ton of semiconductors, especially for things like cybersecurity. And so in a kind of ironic sense, one of the things that ought to benefit the most are companies that make semiconductor equipment or have the foundries to make value-added semiconductors that'll be in all sorts of things, including infrastructure spending.
Thanks so much for that. That was Mike Hansen, the Senior Vice President of Research at Fisher Investments. Before I go then, here are some of the top stories in the infrastructure space. US Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm has said President Biden will push through his infrastructure plan without the support of Republican lawmakers if he can't reach a bipartisan deal. Her comments come after Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell vowed last week to fight it, quote, every step of the way. Emergency crews are working to prevent the collapse of a wastewater reservoir in Florida after officials warned of an imminent threat of flooding over the weekend. The US Army Corps of Engineers worked with local teams to drain the Piney Point Reservoir in a bid to prevent a major breach that could unleash a cascade of wastewater into the surrounding area. The worsening week-old leak in the containment wall prompted authorities to order the evacuation of more than 300 homes, with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declaring a state of emergency on Saturday. And finally, the Suez Canal Authority is considering expanding the southern section of the waterway where the container ship Ever Given became stranded, blocking the shipping route for a week. The authority says it will continue to take ships that large, but will improve its ability to deal with future problems. And that's your roundup of the infrastructure sector. I'm Elena Casas, and this is Reuters.